Part 2, Chapter 1. Sometimes in dreams there are visions of the past. For that reason, Alice Prentice had always welcomed sleep, but she suffered an insomniac's dread of the time just before sleeping, the act of falling asleep itself, the perilous twilight of semi-awareness when the mind must struggle for coherence, when a siren or a cry in the street is the very sound of terror and the ticking of the clock which is a steady reminder of death. Now, with Bobby gone in the army, she had found that whiskey was a great help. Under its protection, she could allow her memory free rein. She could dwell without chagrin on the tenderest, most painful times in her life, and draw comfort from the belief that nothing was ever as bad as it seemed, that everything somehow worked out for the best. She could even remember Bethel, Connecticut, the long bleak time after coming home from Paris, when it seemed every day and every night that she couldn't possibly be more lonely. Her fine old colonial house was a pleasure. At least it would have been a pleasure if she'd had a man to share it with. And she had made a studio out of the old barn behind it, where she was managing to get a good deal of work done. But she couldn't work all the time. In the evenings after Bobby was asleep, she would listen to the radio. The big floor model Majestic that had been her one great extravagance since coming back from France. But even the most entertaining programs were seldom enough to divert her from the knowledge of what she was really doing. She was waiting for the telephone to ring. On the increasingly rare occasions when it did ring, it was most often her sister Eva, calling precisely because she knew how lonely Alice was. An old maid, 6 years her senior and forever bossy and meddlesome and condescending. With the best of intentions, Eva was the only other member of her family to have fled the Middle West. She was a nurse in a New York hospital and seemed to have nothing better to do with her free time than to pester Alice with kindly disapproval. She had disapproved of her marriage to George and then disapproved of the divorce. Now she wasn't at all sure she could approve of Alice's new way of living. "But you're so remote out there," she would say. "There can't be very much for you in the way of, social life. Really, dear, I can't help being concerned." And Alice would try, unsuccessfully, to explain that no concern was warranted. It was after one of these dismal conversations that Alice began to toy with the idea of calling up some of the people she and George had known in New Rochelle. The trouble was that everyone they'd known there was happily married, or almost everyone. When she first thought of Harvey Spangler, the doctor who had brought Bobby into the world, she knew at once that she ought to know better. Harvey Spangler was married, but that had never kept him from enjoying a reputation as a ladies' man around New Rochelle. Nor had that reputation kept Alice from confiding in him more than once. It was in the privacy of Harvey Spangler's office, in fact, that she'd first breathlessly poured out the news of her intention to leave George and go to Paris. And Harvey, calm and solicitous, had seemed to understand. Still, it would be indiscreet to call him now, and so she didn't. She waited until several days later, when she called him at his office to inquire, in as neutral a way as she could manage, if he could recommend a general practitioner in the Bethel area. "Well, Alice," he said, "it's good to hear from you." And the very next evening, his voice enriched with what she suspected was several drinks too many, he called her back to ask if he might drive out to see her. She knew it was a mistake to say yes, and that was only the first of her mistakes. Bustling around the house to make it ready for him, taking a bath and changing her clothes, tiptoeing into Bobby's room to make sure he was asleep, bringing out a bottle of whiskey on a tray with 2 glasses, waiting for the sound of his car. Oh, there was no excuse for it, no excuse at all. But she had no one but herself to blame when he took her in his arms almost at once, and when he took her impatiently and almost roughly to bed. And that was only the beginning. He stayed all night, which meant that she had to find some acceptable way of dealing with him in the morning. She let him sleep while she fixed Bobby's breakfast, and she was careful to keep Bobby quiet so as not to disturb him. Even so, she knew there would be an awkward confrontation when he came downstairs. And there was. He came into the kitchen wearing his wrinkled gabardine suit with the vest unbuttoned and held together with his watch chain. His hair was combed, but his shirt was wilted and he hadn't shaved. He looked weak with hangover and badly confused. "Good morning," she said, and she was aware that Bobby, looking up from his cream of wheat, had fixed him with a malevolent stare. "Well," Harvey said, "who's this big fella?" "Say good morning to Dr. Spangler, dear," she said, and then, "I guess he doesn't remember you." "He looks fine, Alice." Harvey was clearly grateful for a chance to dispense a professional opinion. Little underweight, but otherwise fine. "What would you like for breakfast, Harvey?" "Oh, just coffee will be fine for now." And the three of them were seated at the table, if not quite companionably, at least in a state of truce. "Mind if I smoke a cigar?" Harvey inquired, withdrawing one of the white owls that crowded his vest pocket. And Bobby watched with mixed fascination and distaste as he filled the kitchen with its acrid smoke. "Isn't it a wonderful day?" Alice said. "They said it was going to rain, but it's just lovely. The sky is so blue and clear. Bobby, if you're finished, why don't you run outdoors for a little while?" "I don't feel like it." "But it's too nice a morning to stay indoors. Don't you want to go and see what the other children are doing?" "No." Eventually, though he slid down off his chair and sidled out of the kitchen, pausing to look back at Harvey Spangler with suspicion. "He really does look well, Alice," Harvey said when he was gone. "Looks like you're taking good care of him." "He's wonderful. I don't know what I'd do without him." Thoughtfully stirring his coffee, Harvey ventured to ask a delicate question. "Does George get to see much of him?" "Of course he does, as often as he wants to. He had him just last weekend, 3 whole days at Atlantic City." "Atlantic City? That must have cost a lot." "I suppose it did. It was his idea, not mine." That was the only time they mentioned George, though they sat talking for another 20 minutes or so. Or rather, Alice talked while Harvey Spangler listened and nodded and seemed to be waiting only for a decent chance to leave. Why couldn't she stop talking? Did all lonely people have that problem? She was telling him about Paris, trying to make it sound exciting, but fully aware from the clumsy, hesitant way she pronounced French names that she was betraying how confused and unpleasant a time she'd had there. "And you see, there are 2 railroad stations with names that sound almost exactly alike," she was saying. "One is the Gare de Lyon, the other one is the Gare d'Orléans. Clear over on the other side of the city. Only I didn't know that. So if it hadn't been for that taxi driver, I might have ended up goodness knows where." And Harvey Spangler managed an appropriate chuckle, examining the ash of his cigar. Then, with relief, she left off talking about Paris and asked him to admire the unusual width of the floorboards. She wanted to point out features of the house that she hadn't had time to show him last night. "Only the pre-revolutionary houses have floorboards like that," she said. "And do you see the old pegheads instead of nails? And did I show you my wonderful old Dutch oven in the fireplace? Come and look. Careful of your head now." Crouching low, for he was a tall man and all the doors were short, he followed her into the creaking silence of the living room, where he joined her in a respectful scrutiny of the Dutch oven. "It's quite a place," he said. "How much you paying for it, Alice?" And when she told him the rent, he was astounded. "Can you afford that much?" She gave a nervous little laugh. "Well, just barely, but it really is a bargain when you think of how few of the old colonials are available at all. Over in Westport, they're a lot more expensive." Well, but that's Westport, he said. That's fashionable. This is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Well, she said, anyway, we like it. It certainly is attractive, I'll say that for it. And the main advantage, she said, brightening again, the main advantage is the studio. It's really just an old barn, but I remodeled it and put in a skylight. Come and look. Then he was following her out into the sunshine, across the expanse of unmowed lawn that led to the barn. Isn't it wonderful? She demanded. Look at all the space I've got. Not bad, he said, pacing the rotted wooden flooring. Not bad at all. I can see you've really fixed the place up. Must have been a lot of work. Oh, not really. The skylight was the main thing, and I had a carpenter do that. All I really did was clean it out and paint it and fix the door. And I got electric wiring put in from the house so I can work at night sometimes. Most of the sculpture was hidden under muslin cloths, which spared her from showing it to him. The only exposed pieces were two life-size garden figures, the goose girl, which she had recently cast into plaster, and the one she was currently working on in clay, the fawn. I'm afraid the goose girl isn't at her best, she said. She really shouldn't be seen until I get her painted. She's going to be green, you see, to look like bronze. Looks fine to me. Well, but they always look so garish and chalky when they've just been cast. Anyway, I think it's a nice composition. But the one I'm really excited about is this new one, the fawn. I've done quite a few of these garden things, and they've all been girls. But I guess girls are more traditional in garden sculpture. But then it occurred to me to do something with a boy. It suddenly struck me that I've got this wonderful little boy for a model, and I've simply been letting him go to waste. I can see that. I mean, I can see where you put a lot of Bobby into it. Well, I wasn't trying for a likeness in the face. I wanted the face to be sort of, well, elfin. And like a fawn. But it's Bobby's body. It's Bobby's little arms and back and tummy. Of course, it's still unfinished. Here, look. You can see what I'm getting at in some of these drawings. And she showed him her sketch pad, where her conception of the fawn was complete. A boy of Bobby's age, from the head to the thighs, holding a bunch of grapes in one arm and eating an apple with the other hand. But from the thighs down, his legs were an animal's, with fetlocks and cloven hooves. Do you like it? Well, you know me on the subject of art, Alice, he said. I mean, I'm certainly no judge or anything. It looks fine to me. It's very fanciful. Oh, good. That's just what I was hoping you'd say. And I've got a wonderful idea for the next one. The next one's going to be Pan. Let me show you. And she turned a page to reveal a drawing of a little boy kneeling in shrubbery playing the pipes of Pan. Well, Harvey Spangler said, that looks fine, Alice. A bumblebee was trapped inside the skylight, buzzing loud and frantically against the brilliant pane. And Harvey stared up at it as if in the hope that it might excuse him from looking at any more sculpture or making any more comments. Then he said, well, I guess I'd better be getting started, Alice. It's a long drive. Back in the kitchen, he gathered her up in a cozy, awkward embrace, kissing her hair and the tip of her nose, and she rested her head against his chest for a moment. And then he stood apart from her and straightened his clothes. Take care of yourself now, he said. I will, Harvey. You too. She walked out to the car with him and stood watching while he got it started and backed it out into the street. A little group of neighborhood children stood watching too, with wide-eyed, expressionless faces, and one of the smaller ones was Bobby. When he was gone, heading back for New Rochelle, there was nothing for Alice to do but sit in the studio and hold her head in both hands with her eyes closed tight. Harvey Spangler. A dull, humorless, middle-aged New Rochelle doctor. A man with a wife and 4 children. And as if her behavior last night wasn't bad enough, there was the shame of her performance this morning. Running around the kitchen like a bride on a honeymoon, smiling at him while he blew his horrible cigar smoke in Bobby's face, and taking him to the studio, showing him her work, asking for his opinions, being pleased, yes, pleased, when he said he liked something. Harvey Spangler. But soon she got up and began walking around smoking a cigarette, trying to pull herself together. It was almost time to go in and fix lunch. "Where's Dr. Spankler?" Bobby inquired while she worked at the stove. "Dr. Spangler," she corrected. "He went home, dear. He was only here for breakfast." "Oh, where does he live?" "In New Rochelle, dear, where we used to live." "Did I live there?" "Of course you did. That's where you were born." "Did Daddy live there?" "Of course. Hurry and wash your hands now. This soup is almost ready." When lunch was over, she went back to the studio and tried to work, but it went badly for nearly an hour before she realized what was wrong. The children were playing just outside the barn door, and the noise of their voices made it impossible to concentrate. She took several deep breaths so that her voice wouldn't sound shrill. Then she went to the door and opened it. "Would you children mind playing somewhere else?" she said. There were 4 or 5 of them. Bobby and one of the little Mancini boys were the smallest, and the older Mancini girl was the biggest, a gangling 9-year-old with a sly, insolent face. "We weren't making any noise, Mrs. Prentice," she said. "Well, I can't work as long as you're playing here. Please, children, I've got some important work to do. Just find some other place to play." "Can we watch you, Mrs. Prentice?" "Some other time you can, not just now." "Even if we don't make any noise?" "No. Please now, children, just do as I say." And finally, laggardly, they moved away to another part of the yard. Watching them go, she felt a tremor of dislike for the Mancini girl. The child was too much like her mother, whom Alice suspected of being a malicious gossip. And it was a pity because the father was so nice. A rough, jovial Italian who worked in one of the Danbury hat factories, and who'd gone out of his way to be neighborly when Alice first moved in. There were no more interruptions for nearly 2 hours when she got some work done. Or so it seemed, at least, until she stopped to look at it from across the room. Then, with a terrible suddenness, it seemed that there was something very much the matter with the fawn's left arm, the one that held the grapes. She had labored too hard over it. It was stiff and lifeless with overwork, and so was the left hip. But it wasn't hopeless. She could still save it if the daylight lasted long enough and if she allowed herself to concentrate on nothing else. She went quickly out across the yard to see where the children were. "Bobby," she called, "can I see you a minute, please?" And he detached himself from the group and walked toward her. He looked reluctant, which prompted her to be especially nice when she got him alone. "Dear, would you mind posing for me again this afternoon just for an hour or so?" He was willing. "It'll be just like the other times," she said when they were back in the studio and she was helping him get undressed. "Except that this time we won't use the apple and the grapes. But if you pose very well and don't move, you can have all the apples and grapes you want afterwards. How would that be?" She took him to the right spot under the skylight and positioned his feet, one a little forward and one back. Then she arranged his arms, one crooked as if holding the grapes and the other raised with his hand to his mouth. "There," she said. "That's fine. Well, this will be such a help to me if you'll just hold that pose. You really are a wonderful model." The light was perfect, and in a little while she felt she was getting the arm right. "That's wonderful, dear," she would say abstractedly from time to time, shifting her gaze back and forth from his sunlit flesh to the clay. "And you're doing fine. And hold still now. Don't move." What a pleasure it was to work when the work went well. It was a pleasure that took care of everything else, that made everything else fall away in unimportance. And it always took her back to Cincinnati and to her second year at the academy, the years she'd abandoned painting and discovered sculpture. See how you like it. Willard Slade. Sometimes she could go through whole weeks without thinking of him, but he was always there to remember at times like this. And that was what he had always said, see how you like it, in a casual, offhand way when he introduced her to something that would enrich her life forever. The funny part was that she hadn't even liked him at first. A sarcastic, unkempt, and almost loutish young man, with his hands usually dirty from working on his dreadful motorcycle. Not at all the kind of boy her parents would have liked. She couldn't understand why all the other boys either despised or admired him, and why the boys she liked best were the ones who admired him most. He never seemed to pay attention in class, and he made fun of most of the instructors. She thought him rude and spoiled, and she didn't like to be around him for fear he might say something awful. But that was before she begun to learn what everyone else seemed to know instinctively, that Willard Slade was a genius. It wasn't that he was always brilliant. Sometimes he would work and work over a piece, and it would turn out to be as dull and forced as everyone else's, and he'd throw it away. But there were other times, and they begun to happen more and more frequently, times when, as he would have said, he was feeling right. When what he did was apparently effortless and was much, much better than good, and the teachers would look at him in open envy. He was wonderful. See how you like this, he'd said to her once and handed her a copy of Keats's poems. And she'd taken it home and studied it for days, memorizing several of the more obscure poems so as to be able to surprise him. And in the end, when she went carefully through her recitation of one of them as they sat in Lytle Park, he said, "Yeah, that's nice, but it's one of the sissy ones. I like the later stuff better. Try this one." And he handed the book back to her, open at the page of Ode on a Grecian Urn, which she'd skipped because she'd thought it was too famous to bother with. "Read it out loud," he said. And so she read it, really read it, for the first time. "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time." And when she got to the end, to the overwhelming final 2 lines, she started to cry. Oh, there had been nothing at all she wouldn't do for Willard Slade. He asked her to marry him, and her life took on an unbelievable richness until October 8th, 1914, when Willard Slade ran his motorcycle into a trolley car and was instantly killed. It was years before she got over it. Years spent first back in Plainville, then breaking into the advertising business in Cleveland, and then in New York, where Willard Slade had always wanted to go. And sometimes, like this afternoon, it seemed that she hadn't gotten over it yet, and never would. "Mommy?" "What, dear?" "My nose itches." "Then you'd better scratch it, silly boy. I'll wait while you do." He scratched it, then resumed his careful pose. "Move your hand just a little higher, dear." "No, the other one." "There, that's fine. You're really helping your mommy a lot. Would you like to talk while you're posing?" "All right. Fine. Why don't you tell me about what you did in Atlantic City?" "I told you." "You didn't tell me hardly anything at all. You told me about the big waves and the saltwater taffy, and that's all you told me about. And I told you about the chairs on wheels." "Oh, that's right, you did. And I told you about me and Daddy and Uncle Bill getting up on each other's shoulders." "That's right." A small, querulous part of her mind was annoyed that George had taken his brother along on the trip. Bill Prentice was loud and coarse and drank too much, and she hated him. And Uncle Bill was so funny. We kept laughing and laughing, and Irene said Uncle Bill was the funniest man she had ever met in her whole life. And then me and Daddy and Brenda and Irene covered him all up with sand, so just his head was sticking out. That must have been fun. And who were Brenda and Irene? Were they some children you met on the beach? "No, Mommy, they're ladies. They're the ladies we stayed with." "Oh, I see." She was at a difficult place now. a juncture of arm and shoulder on which there was a subtle play of light, and she allowed herself to think about nothing but that. And we kept covering Uncle Bill up with sand, and he kept saying, "Hey, let me out of here." And we kept covering him and covering him. "Hold still now, dear. Maybe we better not talk anymore for a little while. This is the hard part. This is a hard part." The ladies they stayed with, she was doing her very best not to think about it, to think only of the tip of her modeling tool in the clay, but it was impossible. "And were they nice ladies?" she inquired. "Is the hard part over?" "What?" "Oh, yes, the hard part's over." "Were they nice ladies?" "Yes, I liked Irene best because she smelled so pretty, and she played with me a lot. Brenda was nice too, but she kept wanting to hug and kiss me all the time." "I see." She put down the tool and got out her cigarettes, and she was just about to say, "Let's rest a minute, Bobby," when she heard a startling sound from somewhere in the wall behind her, an erupting, burbling sound that she was a little late in identifying as a lewd giggle of children. In the split second of her confusion, she whirled to look at the wall, and she saw them. 3 or 4 pairs of eyes peering in through an inch-wide crack in the wallboards. Eyes that vanished, leaving only sunlight in the crack as soon as she discovered them. The sound of their laughter rose up louder as they ran away, and when she turned back to Bobby, he was round-eyed with humiliation, hunched over with both hands hiding his genitals. She wanted to get a hold of that Mancini girl and beat her, hit her across the face. But by the time she got to the door, the children had disappeared. She stood looking out across the bright grass for some time before realizing that there was nothing she could do. She couldn't call up Mrs. Mancini without telling her what it was the children had done, and that would mean having to explain what she and Bobby had been doing. "They're gone, dear," she said, turning back to him. "Let's not worry about those silly children." She persuaded him to pose again, but he was clearly uneasy about it. In a little while she let him get dressed and went on working alone until the light began to fade. It was nearly 5 o'clock, and when she went back to the house, she found she was exhausted. She went to the living room first and turned on the radio for the 5 o'clock news. It was something unintelligible about President Hoover and the Treasury deficit, but she listened to it anyway because she always enjoyed a Lowell Thomas. His voice was reassuringly steady and baritone, and there was something nice about the way he always said, "So long, until tomorrow." She turned the volume up in order to hear it in the kitchen while she got dinner started. She had begun to scrape a carrot when Lowell Thomas went off and Kate Smith came on. "When the moon comes over the mountain." And the ridiculous thing was that it made her cry. "Every beam brings a dream, dear, of you." She had to put the carrot and the knife down and stand with her forehead pressed against the kitchen window until her sobs abated. And afterwards, though she felt refreshed and much better, she was ashamed of herself. Keats could make her cry, but so could Kate Smith. Neither she nor Bobby were very hungry, so dinner didn't take very long. She got the dishes washed, and Bobby put to bed a little earlier than usual. And then there was nothing to do. She listened to the radio and then tried to read, but thoughts of Harvey Spengler kept obtruding on the page. After a while, she got up and began walking around the room, smoking one cigarette after another. If only there were some way to escape the evening hours. When the telephone rang, it was such an unexpected, exciting event that she let it ring 3 or 4 times before answering it, knowing it would probably be Eva, but savoring the fact that it might be anyone at all. It was George. "Did I get you up?" he inquired. "No, I wasn't in bed." "Listen, Alice," he began in a tone that warned her of unpleasantness. "I'm calling because there's something very important that we've got to discuss. All right? They're putting through another cutback in salaries and commissions next month. That means I'll be making an awful lot less money, and in fact, I'm lucky to have a job at all." "I see. So what it amounts to is that we're simply going to have to economize, Alice. I'm afraid you'll have to give up that place in the country." "But it's cheaper here than in the city." "Alice, I know what that place is costing you in rent alone. Do you know what other people are paying for rent? Do you know what I'm paying for rent? And how much? She started to tremble and had to hold the phone in both hands. How much did it cost to take your lady friends to Atlantic City? Look, Alice, that has nothing to do with. Please try to be reasonable. And she did her best. She listened while he explained about good, inexpensive apartments in Queens, and while he offered to find her such a place himself, and she knew that by her silence she was concurring in his wishes, or at least expressing willingness to abandon the house in Bethel. But then it was her turn, and she gripped the phone in both hands again. At first, she was scarcely aware of what she was saying. She knew only that she wanted to hurt him as badly as possible, and she knew that the force and rhythm of her words were building to an inevitable climax. And I don't care how many lawyers you get. I'll never, ever let my child be exposed to you and your little whores again. Do you understand me? Never. She hung up the phone, and when it rang again a moment later, she didn't answer it. She let it ring 10 times, and then it stopped. She thought she heard Bobby crying and went upstairs to see, but he seemed to be sleeping peacefully. She tucked the covers more securely around him and moved his teddy bear closer to his head just in case. Downstairs again, she walked around the living room, twisting her hands together, going over and over the things she wished she had thought of saying to George. Then, as her breathing and her blood slowed down, she sat quietly in a chair. After a while, she started thinking about the fawn again and wondering how it looked. Sometimes, if you looked at a piece of sculpture under artificial light after working on it all day, you could see new things in it. There was a full moon, which made it easy to walk to the barn. And once she was inside, there was enough blue-gray glow from the skylight to show her the outlines of the fawn. It didn't look bad at all. Then she switched on the lights, and after the first shock of brightness, she had to stand biting her lip for a full minute before she could admit how disappointed she was. All the work she'd done today looked crude. But then, moving back a few steps and squinting, she was able to see the beginnings of something promising, and she began to breathe normally again. She knew better than to touch it now, but if she had a good day tomorrow, she might still be able to bring it off. She looked at several other pieces, seeing things she could improve in all of them. But she had to leave the studio soon because she kept thinking of Harvey Spangler standing there with his garbadine suit and his awful cigar saying, "Well, you know me on the subject of art, Alice." Instead of going back to the house, she went up into the field behind the barn. She wanted to be as far as possible from the thoughts of Harvey Spangler and of the Mancini girl and of George and even of Bobby. And no sooner was she standing in the tall, windswept grass of the hillside than she was crying again. But this time there was no pleasure in it. All she could think of was another poem Willard Slade had liked. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. Well, she was sick for home, all right, and she didn't mean New Rochelle or New York or Cleveland or Connecticut, and she certainly didn't mean Paris. She was sick for Plainville, Indiana, and for her dead mother and father, and for all her sisters, even Eva, and for a lost and innocent time when everybody knew she was the baby of the family. Chapter 2. After Bethel, there were 3 trying but hopeful years in Greenwich Village. They moved to a different studio apartment each year, Alice seeking a new peace and a brave new foundation for her career with each move. And it wasn't until the end of the 3rd year that all her loneliness dissolved with the advent of Sterling Nelson. Never, in the most wistful of her longings, had she imagined that a man like Sterling Nelson might exist for her. She had long been resigned, in fact, to the idea that no man would ever exist for her again, not in any kind of responsible, durable way. She had come to accept the probability that the rest of her life would be spent in what Natalie Crawford called a state of single blessedness. Natalie Crawford was her neighbor on Charles Street, a twice-divorced, childless woman who had some sort of job with an advertising agency, who burned incense in her apartment and believed in her Ouija board and liked to use words like simpatico, and who habitually found respite from her own state of single blessedness with any man she could get her hands on. Alice didn't like her very much, or at least didn't wholly approve of her. But for lack of other friends, she had come to rely on her, to spend excessive amounts of time with her and attend her frantic parties, and even borrow small sums of money from her at times when she couldn't make her income stretch through the month. And the ironic thing was that one of Natalie Crawford's parties should have been the occasion of her meeting Sterling Nelson. He was nothing at all like most of the men Natalie knew. Men who drank too much and delighted in their rudeness and got into raucous quarrels. He was tall and dignified and aristocratic, with graying temples and a little graying mustache. He was talking quietly in a small group of other nice-looking people she had never seen before, aloof from the mainstream of the party. And from the moment she saw him, she wanted urgently to find some way of breaking through all the noise and smoke and getting close to him, of reaching out to touch the sleeve of his handsome suit, for he was beautifully dressed in tweeds that could have only come from England, and of letting him know that she was different too. But a dreadful man named Mike Driscoll, who had recently been fired from a publishing house, had her backed into a corner and was demanding to know how she felt about the CIO, and she had scarcely escaped him before she got involved in a drunken argument between Paul and Mary Engstrom. "Do you know what you are when you're like this?" Paul asked his wife, who had been supporting him for nearly a year since he'd lost his job on the New York Sun. "I mean, seriously, do you know what you are? Because I'll tell you." "I don't have to take this, do I, Alice?" Mary said. "Is there any reason why I have to take this from him?" "Listen, goddammit, you know what you are? You're a goddamn little snot-nosed Jewish bitch. That's what you are." And that was when she heard Natalie's voice rising up behind them. "Come along over there," Natalie was saying. "I want you to meet these nice people. Paul and Mary Engstrom. Alice Prentice. This is Sterling Nelson." And the first thing he said to her was the least expected, nicest, and most encouraging thing she could have imagined. "I hear you're an artist." She talked to no one else for the rest of the evening, and Sterling Nelson talked to no one but her. He was indeed English, and from his quiet, reticent talk, she learned several other things about him. That he was in New York to represent a British export firm, a businessman with far too much sophistication to take his business seriously, that he was an art lover, and that he had evidently traveled all over the world. It wasn't until later that she found out more specific and still more impressive details, that he'd been decorated as a submarine commander during the war and had later held important positions with the colonel service in places like Burma. The trouble was that she couldn't stop her voice, or even control it. Helplessly, she heard herself saying one inane or pretentious thing after another while his polite, lightly sweating face continued to nod and smile, and the rest of the room swam around them in a dizzying blur. All she knew was that if she stopped talking, he might go away. And then she began to fear that if she stopped talking, he might be better able to notice all the things she knew were wrong with her. Her dress, which was neither new nor wholly clean, and which she was almost sure was visibly wet under the arms, and her hair, which badly needed combing, and the fact that she was wearing too much lipstick too hastily applied. She wanted to escape to Natalie Crawford's bathroom and work on herself at the mirror, composing herself. But if she did that, there was a terrible chance that he'd be gone when she came back. So there was nothing to do but stand there, gripping her warm, sticky drink with both hands, and go on talking. Then suddenly the people he'd come with were gathering their coats to leave, and he cordially excused himself and was gone. And no sooner had the door closed behind him than Natalie Crawford was bearing down on her through the smoke. "Isn't he wonderful?" Natalie demanded. "I can't imagine where they found him, but isn't he marvelous?" And Alice began sidling away, trying to leave before Natalie could say he was simpatico. All she wanted then was to get her own coat and get out of here, to go home alone and make sure Bobby was all right, and then go to bed and weep. And that was what she did. So it was much more than a delightful surprise when she picked up her ringing telephone the very next day and heard, "Mrs. Prentice, Sterling Nelson here." When he came to visit her studio, she was a little anxious that he might not like her sculpture, but he was kind and respectful about the few pieces she dared to show him, and soon she found herself wholly at ease. She knew she looked better this time. She had bought a new dress for the occasion and spent a long time over her makeup, and her self-confidence was so improved that she let him do most of the talking. She was aware that most of what few things she said came out exactly right. Cool, but promising, and one or two of her phrases even seemed to strike him as witty. He took her to the sidewalk cafe at the Brevoort, where nobody had taken her for years, and which she now decided was the finest restaurant she had ever been to in her life. Sitting at that elegant table as the final glow of sunset gave way to darkness, with their heads just visible to passers-by beyond the neat little potted shrubs, she kept hoping someone she knew would walk past and see them there. She even hoped for strangers to notice them and to wonder enviously who they were. Then he took her home to his own place, which turned out to be a spacious apartment on Gramercy Park that was filled with wonders. Its walls were heavy with books and with dark paintings of kinds and periods that she wouldn't ordinarily have responded to, except that each was so clearly a gem in its own right, framed in gilt and lighted with a little museum lamp. "This is a Poussin," he was saying, "and this over here is a Murillo, one of the early Murillos. I've always liked the Spaniards of that school. Of course, I expect you know a good deal more about these things than I do." But the pictures were only the beginning. Every piece of furniture was a valuable-looking antique, Moorish and Italian and French, and there were two charmingly rough-hewn three-legged chairs that were primitive relics of Elizabethan England. The mementos of his years in the Orient included a heavy ivory-hafted sword that he called a Burmese dar, and one long wall of his bedroom was emblazoned with a great bright tapestry that he explained was a purdah. If you follow the figures in it, you see, it tells a kind of pictorial narrative. It's meant to portray the rite of exhuming and reinterring the finger bones of Buddha. Whole thing's a bit garish by our standards, I'm afraid. The colors and whatnot. That's why I've consigned it here to the bedroom. He was standing in the bedroom doorway when he said this, pouring brandy into two snifters, and he looked up briefly and shyly while she studied the purdah. "Hate to part with it, though. It was given me with a good deal of ceremony when I left the colony as a sort of token." "Oh, I don't think it's garish at all," she said, accepting one of the snifters. "I think it's beautiful." And she moved delicately past him to re-explore the other rooms, while he hovered close behind her. "Really," she said, "really, Sterling, this whole apartment is beautiful. All your things are so different from each other, and yet you've managed to make them all harmonize. Oh, that's not the right word. That sounds like an interior decorator or something. What I mean is that you've made everything whole. You've achieved. But Sterling Nelson gave her no chance to finish telling him what he had achieved. He had taken the brandy glass away from her and set it down on a table. He had taken her by the shoulder and turned her around and kissed her hard and full on the mouth. Within a very few weeks, his apartment had become the warm center of her world. There were difficulties. It would have been too good to be true if there hadn't been, but there were times when it seemed that no difficulties in the world could fail to be resolved if only good fortune allowed her to stay with this wise, calm, splendid man. The main difficulty was that Sterling Nelson had a wife in England from whom he wasn't yet technically divorced. He sometimes talked of the brief voyage he would have to make next fall to make it final. She never knew what to say when he mentioned that, but he always managed to make it clear that the whole business was a matter of tiresome legal details, to be taken care of and dismissed with as much dispatch as possible. Another difficulty, at least at first, was Bobby. She knew it was only natural for Bobby to resent her spending so much time away from home, and she understood, too, that Sterling, with no children of his own, might find himself uncomfortable in the presence of a child. Even so, it troubled her that they were so awkward with each other. Bobby was always good about saying, "Hello, Mr. Nelson," and "Good night, Mr. Nelson," and it always pleased her to see them solemnly shake hands man to man. But one evening, Bobby made a terrible scene. He had been tense and irritable all afternoon, claiming his stomach hurt, and he kept getting in her way while she was trying to dress. Then he sat down in the middle of the floor and started to cry and said, "I don't want you to go out." She didn't know whether to scold or mollify him. She tried both, which only made him worse. "I hate Mr. Nelson," he cried, fighting her off when she tried to put her arms around him. And he was still in the full heat of his rage when Sterling came in and stood watching, looking bewildered. "Sterling, I'm sorry about this. He's upset because we're..." But Bobby, hiding his face in shame at being seen in tears, scrambled up and ran tragically to his room and slammed the door behind him. Sterling sat down uneasily. "Is he sick?" "No, I don't think so. He said his stomach hurt. But I think it's mostly just a tantrum." And she looked helplessly toward the slammed door. "A bit old for that sort of nonsense, isn't he?" Sterling said. "I suppose he is. I don't know. But the point is, I have been spending a lot of time apart from him, and I think he feels neglected." Sterling said, shifting his feet and folding his hands in his lap. "Well, in any case, I expect Mrs. What's-her-name can look after him tonight, can't she? The woman who sits with him?" "I suppose so." But she still yearned toward the silent bedroom door. She could picture him flung face down across his bed, exhausted and ashamed and alone in the deepening shadows, too miserable now even to cry, and she knew he would be waiting for her. "Sterling," she said, "why don't you fix yourself a drink and I'll just go in and talk to him. I won't be a minute." "Talk to him? I must say I fail to see the point of that, Alice. Wouldn't you just be starting up the whole silly business again?" And then her own voice came close to tears. "Oh, Sterling, please try to understand." It was the nearest thing to a quarrel they'd ever had, and as her voice rose before his blinking face, she was touched with panic. What if he couldn't understand? I can't just leave him in there, don't you see? Oh, if he had a father, it'd be different, but I'm all he has in the world. Can't you see that? In the end, they took him out to dinner with them, to the Brevoort. He had washed his face and put on his best clothes, and in the aftermath of hysteria, he was by turns chagrined and over-exhilarated. At first, they couldn't get a word out of him. He hung his head and kept avoiding Sterling's patient, kindly eyes. Then all at once he started talking as if he would never stop. He had made a mess of his dinner plate, mixing everything together with his fork into an unsightly mush, and he explained this procedure at shrill and elaborate length. "I don't really like peas, you see," he said, "and I don't like this kind of potatoes, and I don't much like this kind of gravy. So you see what I do is I just mix them all together, and then they don't taste so bad. I always do that whenever I get a whole bunch of a bunch of different food. I always do that whenever I get a whole bunch of different kinds of foods I don't like, and it makes everything taste a whole lot better. Just mix them all up together and you don't even taste the things you don't like. I mean, it tastes good this way. He went on and on, while Sterling stoically endured the monologue, while Alice tried ineffectually to quiet him down. And people at neighboring tables glanced over in open irritation at the spectacle of such an ill-behaved little boy. He didn't stop talking all the way home, except to break away from them on the sidewalk to demonstrate his prowess at leapfrogging fire hydrants. He didn't stop talking, in fact, until Alice had managed to get him into bed and put out his light and shut his door. Then she said, "Oh, Sterling, thank you so much. I know it was awful for you, but you were wonderful." And after that, Bobby became more and more a participant. They didn't take him to the Brevoort again, but they began going to the Brevoort less frequently themselves. More often, Alice would fix dinner for the three of them at home, and they'd usually wait until Bobby was in bed before going to Sterling's place. Sterling didn't seem to mind. He was consistently kind and fatherly and stern without ever being harsh, and he seemed to enjoy the increasing evidence of Bobby's attachment to him. One evening, he brought an illustrated book for boys, British Submarine Service in the Great War, and Bobby sat silent and spellbound, turning the pages while Sterling explained the pictures and told tantalizingly cryptic anecdotes about his own submarine service. And Alice, watching them from the kitchen doorway, allowed herself to indulge in a happy daydream of the three of them together forever, of Bobby grown tall and disciplined and calling Sterling Dad. When the heat of the city grew unbearable that summer, Sterling sent them both away for a week to a cool lake in New Jersey, where they learned, or almost learned, to catch perch and sunfish with the rod and reeling that Sterling had equipped them with, and where they sat for hours under a great shade tree while Alice read aloud from Sterling's volume of Great Expectations. And when the vacation was over and she felt that neither she nor Bobby could face the wretched city school system again, it was Sterling, one unforgettable night in his bedroom, who first suggested she might consider moving out to Scarsdale. He knew about Scarsdale because one of the items his company imported was lead casement windows, which had enjoyed a vogue in the wealthier Tudor-style homes of the town before the Depression. "Matter of fact, we're still doing a fair amount of business out there," he said. "Seems to be a little isolated pocket of prosperity. In any case, I understand the schools are first-rate. Be a good thing for Bobby. And of course the town itself is charming. Green grass and fresh air and all that. Get you away from all the bother of the city." "It sounds lovely," she said, "but I'm afraid I could never afford it. George keeps saying I'm living beyond my means as it is." "Well, but some of the rentals aren't as high as you might think, Alice. It's a curious thing. Some of the older houses along the post road are rather run down, and they're vacant. As long as they're vacant, the owners are losing money, willing to lease them quite cheaply. It's a thing you might be wise to look into." "You make it sound so easy." But that was one of the wonderful things about Sterling Nelson. He could make any difficult thing sound easy. And the only other man she had ever known who could do that was Willard Slade. All the others, George for example, had made easy things sound difficult. "Might well be simpler than you think," he said, sitting up on the edge of the bed and reaching for his dressing gown. Pay a reasonable price and still have all the advantages." He walked across the room to get a cigarette and refill their brandy glasses. And when he came back, she allowed herself a thrill of girlish pleasure at how handsome he looked in his dressing gown. On any other man it would have been a bathrobe, but the way Sterling wore it made it a dressing gown. He sat on the edge of the bed again and looked at her, still silently inquiring if a move to Scarsdale mightn't be a good idea. And because his eyes were so considerate, she was emboldened to tell him why the plan held so little appeal for her. She reached out and smoothed the silken lapels over the hairs of his chest. But Scarsdale's so far away, she said, and I don't think I could bear being that far away from you. And instead of betraying even the faintest sign of distaste at this confession, he took her in his arms and kissed her as though it had been the very thing he'd hoped she would say. Actually, he said against her ear, that brings up something else I thought I might suggest. Point is, there's really no reason why we'd have to be apart. Then he released her, letting her sink back into the pillows while he began to explain his plan. His lease here on Gramercy Park was soon to expire, and he'd realized for some time that he'd be unwise to renew it. The place really was too expensive, and he would still be less able to afford it after his costly trip to England. In other words, it was only sensible for him to find a new place to live, and he wondered, it's only a suggestion, mind you, just something I thought we might discuss. He wondered if she might consent to their moving out to Scarsdale together. Mightn't it turn out to be a good thing for both of them, for all three of them? And there would, of course, be a distinct economic advantage, sharing the expenses and so on. Oh, it was only a suggestion, but how did it strike her? Sterling, she said, oh, how do you think it strikes me? Don't you know it's the most wonderful, beautiful idea I've ever heard? Whatever made you think how could you possibly have thought I'd say no? He looked pleased, but also deeply serious. Well, he said, it's not as if I could offer you a formal proposal of marriage. Point is, I can't do that, at least, and here he squeezed her hand, at least not yet. Not until this England business is cleared up. All I can offer you now is, well, myself and my love. And she spent the rest of the night assuring him that she would never ask for anything more. Within a few weeks, the house had been found and rented, and the Neptune Moving and Storage Company had been contracted to move the contents of their 2 apartments out to Scarsdale. Alice and Bobby rode out on the train in the early afternoon of the moving day, to be there in plenty of time before the van arrived. And as she stood on the front porch, watching the great truck approach through the trees along the post road, she was almost ill because she could scarcely contain her happiness. First came a barrel of china and kitchenware, and the men tracked bits of excelsior across the floor as she guided them through to the rear of the house. Then they began unloading her furniture, the ugly, once expensive sofa and upholstered chairs, the unwieldy parts of the big dining room table, and the mahogany dresser with the drawer that didn't work. Plain middle-class things that she and George had bought for New Rochelle. Things now grown shabby with the lonely years in Bethel and New York. Things that looked somehow all the more forlorn for being heavily bumped and hauled through the Scarsdale sunshine. The men were mincingly gentle with the majestic radio, but they didn't quite know how to deal with her sculpture, which she steered into the garage that was to serve as her studio. Then came several trunks and any number of sloppy cardboard boxes filled with odds and ends and Bobby's toys. That was all there was of their own belongings, and the great padded cavern of the moving van was still far from empty. The rest of the load was Sterling Nelson's treasure. Oh, please be careful, she cried when one of the men allowed the delicate leg of a rosewood table to scrape against the door jamb. And she scurried around in nervous supervision as they brought in one priceless object after another. Where'd you want this, lady? They would ask, swaying and grunting under their loads, and where'd you want this? And she did her best to make decisions about the placing of the most important pieces. But how could the perfection of Sterling Nelson's apartment be sorted out from this jumble and restored to any kind of coherence in these big, strange rooms? And her distress was compounded when Bobby came in from outside to claim her attention. He was acting as helpless and silly as if he were 4 instead of 8. And it wasn't until she happened to look out a front window that she understood why. Some other boys of about his age were clustered and idling near the van in the driveway. They had appeared from neighboring streets to watch the unloading and to watch Bobby, and his shyness had driven him indoors. I want to help the movers, he said. The movers don't need any help. Please, dear, can't you see I'm busy? Where do you want this, lady? Over there. No, wait. Over here, in this room, next to the big cabinet. Bobby, please stay outside. I don't feel like it. Is it because of those boys? Is that it? No. She sighed and raked back a wet strand of hair from her heated face. Dear, they only want to be friendly. Why don't you go out and make friends with them? I don't feel like it. My stomach hurts. Oh, Bobby, please, can't you see how important it is to make everything nice for when Mr. Nelson comes? Because that was the whole point. Sterling's commuter train would arrive before dusk, and she wanted to make it a homecoming. It wasn't only a matter of putting the house in order. She wanted to be bathed and fresh and wearing clean clothes when his taxi drove up, and when he came striding up the porch steps. She wanted to have a real dinner ready with candles and wine. But she was still frantically unrolling carpets and struggling with boxes long after the movers and their van had left, and the house was still a shambles. No sooner would she get a table or a chest established in what seemed its proper place than it would turn out to be all wrong. Then at last, with the time running out, she found an alcove that made a perfect setting for the two little Elizabethan chairs. In the same swift burst of inspiration, she laid the Burmese dar on the mantelpiece, and the rest of the living room was suddenly easy, or at least it seemed that it could be easy. Everything would fall into place if only she could get the whole splendid length of the purdah hung on the wall opposite the fireplace. She found it rolled up in one of the cardboard boxes, but it turned out to be much heavier than she'd thought. Then, in the depths of another box, she found some brackets that looked strong enough to hold it. If she used enough of them, and she found a hammer and a kitchen chair to stand on for the job, but she would need help. Bobby, will you bring another chair and help me, please? We've got to get this up before Mr. Nelson comes, and I can't do it alone. You stand on that side and hold that end of it, and I'll start putting in the brackets, all right? All right. What is it, anyway? It's a tapestry, dear. It's Burmese. It belongs to Mr. Nelson, and it's very, very valuable. That's why we'll have to be careful. And they stood on their chairs at opposite ends of the purdah, Bobby doing his best to keep the weight of the thing held high while Alice carefully hammered in one bracket after another in what she could only hope was a straight line, hooking each bracket of the burlap backing of the tapestry and inching her chair along toward Bobby's as she made progress. It's wonderful, dear. You're really being a great help. Just keep holding up your end and we'll be done in no time. What are they doing anyway? Who, dear? The people in the tapestry. Well, you see, they're Burmese people, and they believe in a god called Buddha, and they're performing a religious ceremony. Can you hold it up a little higher? There, that's fine. How do you mean, a religious ceremony? I mean, what are they doing? Well, actually, it's very interesting. They're transplanting Buddha's finger bones. Doing what? Transplanting? Oh, that's not the right word. They're taking the finger bones of Buddha from one grave, you see, and putting them into another. Oh, how come you don't get to see them? Get to see what, dear? The finger bones. Well, because it's all symbolic. I mean, they're not really. It's just a ceremony, you see. Mr. Nelson can explain it to you. The hammering in of each bracket caused a little crumbling hole in the plaster, and the brackets wobbled as she hooked them into the burlap. But she felt that with luck, they would have enough collective grip to hold. When she finished, when she'd moved her chair up next to Bobby's and put in the final bracket, she felt a sense of triumph. It was up. But when they got down and walked away to look at the purdah, the first thing she saw was that it wasn't quite straight. Then there was a slight loose sputtering sound as one after another of the brackets gave way, and down it fell. The whole purdah lumped in a hideous heap on the floor, spraying brackets as it came and leaving a row of ugly little sockets in the naked wall. She began to weep. And at that very moment there was a thumping on the boards of the front porch and a cry of, "Hello! Hello!" "Oh, Sterling. Sterling, I'm so sorry. I wanted to have everything ready for you, and we did try, but look at everything. Just look at it." He did his best to comfort her, but he was as damp and unsteady as she herself. His shirt and suit were rumpled from the train, and there was an anxious, bewildered look about his eyes. "I thought at least I'd get the purdah hung before you came, and we tried and tried, but we couldn't make it stay up. Look at it." "It wants a rod," he said. "A what?" "A rod. Quite a heavy curtain rod sort of thing, with heavy screws. Must be packed somewhere. Those little hooks won't take the weight, you see. And now look at those awful little holes in the wall. Oh, Sterling, I'm so sorry." "We can fix the holes later, putty 'em up. We have plenty of time. Look what I brought." Only then did she notice that he'd come in laden with packages. He had brought a bottle of scotch and a bottle of champagne, and he'd brought what struck Bobby as the perfect gift, a fielder's glove from Spalding's and a regulation baseball. And so they made the best of it. Alice and Sterling strolled, talking with their drinks through all the rooms, pausing sometimes to sit down on chairs or to stand at a window looking out at Bobby's antics in the yard. He would throw the ball up in an inexpert, underhand way and then run desperately under its flight and try to catch it. He always missed, and when he'd retrieved the ball, he would pound it firmly into the glove, standing with his legs apart in a manly, athletic pose. Then he'd make another throw and race to miss the ball again. "Doesn't seem to have the knack of it," Sterling said. "Oh, he'll be all right. He'll learn. Afraid I won't be much use to him there. The whole subject of baseball is rather a blank to me." "The other boys will teach him. He'll be fine. Why don't you take your drink out to the porch and I'll get dinner started?" If nothing else, she was determined that their first dinner would be a success. The kitchen had an unpleasant smell from the previous tenant's garbage, and the refrigerator made an alarming drone, but she worked with a kind of efficiency that had eluded her all day. From the kitchen door, she called out to Bobby, "Come in and wash, dear. Hurry now." Then, taking her time, she walked proudly through the dining room and the living room and out onto the porch, where she pressed a kiss into the back of Sterling's neck and whispered, "Dinner is served." "Marvelous," he said. He helped her into her chair and stood expertly unwinding the wires of the champagne cork and working it loose with his thumbs. It went flop, in exactly the way champagne corks were supposed to go. And they all laughed in a way that brought the house to life. "Here's to Scarsdale," Alice said, raising her glass. "Here's to the future. Here's to everything." "Right," Sterling said, sitting down. "I must say you've done all this beautifully, Alice. The table, the food, everything looks delicious." Less than a second later, he was on his feet and dabbing urgently at his trousers with his napkin. Bobby had knocked over his glass of milk, and the quick white flood of it had spilled onto Sterling's lap. "Oh, Bobby," she cried, and she was ready to slap him. "Can't you be more careful? Now look at what you've done." "It's all right," Sterling was saying. "Suit wants a cleaning anyway." But the rest of the meal was almost devoid of conversation. Later, though, in the calm, after they'd gotten the dishes washed and Bobby put to bed, there was a peaceful time while they sat on the porch in the darkness, watching the fireflies and the lights of cars going by on the post road. "Doesn't the air smell wonderful?" she said. I just can't believe it. Here we are, and everything's going to be so... Did I tell you Bobby's starting school on Monday?" "No." "Well, he is, the 3rd grade, 3B. There was a long silence while the cars droned past, going toward and away from White Plains, and Alice willed herself not to talk. If Sterling wanted to sit here quietly, that was what they would do. Then at last he started talking. The husky British resonance of his voice was enough to bathe her in reassurance. It didn't even matter that he was discussing the trip he would soon have to make to England. While he talked, she curled up in her wicker chair and felt protected. Would you like a drink, Sterling? Yes, that might be nice. A little scotch. When she went inside to fix it, moving through the unfamiliar rooms and working at the ice trays of the strange refrigerator, she felt a chill of foreboding about how it would be when she and Bobby were alone here. How long had he said he'd have to be in England? 6 weeks? But that could be endured, and anyway, he wouldn't have to go for a little while. She carried the tinkling highballs out to the porch. I don't expect it'll be a very lively community, Alice, he said. Rather a change for you after living in town. Oh, but I don't care, do you? I expect you'll miss your friends. I didn't really have any friends, not real ones. Anyway, we'll make new friends. May not be easy. I imagine they'll be rather dull business people for the most part. Homeowners and all that. Roosevelt haters. Rich and dull and probably a bit inquisitive about our arrangement. Our arrangement? You make it sound like a play. Sterling was silent for a moment in a way that caused her to bite her lip, and she wished she could see his face in the darkness. Then he said, Won't you find it a bit awkward being called Mrs. Nelson and so on? Not if you don't. He gave a little chuckle and reached out across the arms of their chairs to squeeze her hand. I suppose we'll be all right. And she supposed so too. The question of whether or not she would find it awkward being called Mrs. Nelson remained unresolved. Nobody in Scarsdale called her anything at all. Electric trains drew the men away to the city each morning, and the children were swallowed up by school. The women, alone in their big, impeccable houses, let their days slip away in endless rounds of triviality. Or, at least, that was the way Alice saw them in her mind's eye. She pictured them idling through easy household chores or giving instructions to their maids, and painting their fingernails and fixing their hair and compounding their lassitude by spending hours on the telephone with one another, talking of bridge clubs and luncheons and functions of the PTA. If their lives included anything more interesting than that, she didn't learn of it. For none of them ever called her up or dropped in for a neighborly visit, nor apparently did any of their husbands ever strike up an acquaintance with Sterling on the train. Scarsdale behaved as though Alice and Sterling didn't exist. She didn't care. She had her mornings and part of her afternoons free for sculpture in the garage, and she was doing new, exciting work. She had abandoned garden sculpture and was making sculpture for its own sake. Sinuous torsos and semi-abstract animals, things that would make excellent exhibition pieces as soon as she had enough of them to warrant a one-man show. A little after 3 o'clock each day, she would go out across the post road and wait for Bobby's coming home. The school was within easy walking distance, but it was on the other side of the road, and she didn't want him crossing that wide, hectic highway by himself. She took him across each morning and went across to wait for him each afternoon. He didn't seem to mind when he came home, which was most of the time. For the first week or so, in fact, he would break into an eager run for the last few yards and let her hug him, to prove how much he'd missed her all day. But later, when he began walking home in a cluster of other boys, it seemed to embarrass him. I can cross the street by myself, he said. No, you can't. When Sterling found out about it one morning after he'd missed his regular train to the city, he was almost angry with her. You mean to say you do that every day? He asked, looking up from the breakfast table when she'd come back to the house. Take him across the street by the hand? But it's not just a street, it's a highway. And the cars come so terribly fast, I'm almost afraid to cross it myself. Oh, nonsense, Alice. The boy's 8 years old. How's he ever going to learn to look after himself if you keep babying him? I don't baby him, Sterling. Yes, you do. I'm sorry, Alice, but it's a thing I've meant to speak with you about before. He looked grimly at his coffee cup. Well, he said, I expect it's none of my business. In the end, she agreed, reluctantly, to let Bobby cross the street alone, even though it meant standing at the window in the grip of anxiety, morning and afternoon, watching until he had looked both ways and run in awkward safety to the other side. She was willing to agree with Sterling on almost everything now because there was so little time left before his trip and she couldn't bear the thought of any unpleasantness. And it seemed to her that Bobby, by this time, had become as careful as she was about the importance of pleasing Mr. Nelson. He never whined or made childish scenes or tried to monopolize the conversation. He did his homework promptly and without coaxing, and if there was any time left over before bedtime, he would spend it lying prone on the living room carpet, absorbed, or she suspected pretending to be absorbed, in British submarine service in the Great War. One evening, after long preparation, he showed Sterling a slingshot that some boy at school had taught him how to make. A stout and carefully whittled forked stick, with strips of pink rubber cut from an inner tube and a leather sling made from the tongue of an old shoe. "Oh, I say," Sterling said, examining the thing. "That's really fine. That's a first-rate piece of work." And Bobby, hooking both thumbs in his hip pockets, could only duck his head in bashful acceptance of the praise. "Want to try it out?" Sterling asked him. "Have a little target practice?" And Alice fondly watched from a window as the two of them went outdoors in the gathering dusk. Sterling fixed a scrap of paper to a tree for a target, while Bobby collected pebbles for ammunition. Then together they paced off a range and took turns firing the slingshot. But the game had scarcely begun before it ended, and when they came back into the kitchen, Bobby looked pink in the face and close to tears. "It broke," he told her. "Mr. Nelson pulled it back too far and it broke." "The rubber was rotted through, you see," Sterling explained. "All we need is a better piece of inner tube." "But that's the only piece of inner tube I could find. It's hard to find pieces of inner tube." "No," Sterling said, "I shouldn't think it'd be all that hard. I imagine I can find one." But he didn't sound at all sure of it, and for a perilous moment Alice felt as if she had two children on her hands. "Well," she said, "maybe it can be fixed. And anyway, it was fun while it lasted. Hurry along and wash up now, Bobby. Dinner's ready." He did as he was told, after throwing down the broken slingshot with only the smallest display of temper. He didn't sulk over it, and she was proud to notice that he didn't bring the subject up again in the days that followed, even though Sterling had apparently forgotten about finding a better piece of inner tube. When the time of Sterling's departure was only a week away, she suggested shyly that she might go into the city to see him off. She had a pleasant vision of herself smiling and waving, a little tearful among the cheers and streamers and confetti as the great horns sounded and the great ship drew majestically away from the pier. But he said he thought that would be silly. These sailings are always such a crush and a bother, a lot of over-emotional nonsense. I think the less elaborate we make our goodbyes, the better, don't you? Then suddenly the day itself was upon them, and their goodbyes weren't elaborate at all. Breakfast was the same as ever, except that two heavy suitcases stood waiting for removal in the hallway, along with his daily commuter's briefcase. The only other difference was that when they got up from the table, he gave her a little hug and kissed her cheek. Normally, they never kissed in Bobby's presence. And then, with one arm still around her waist, he reached out and shook Bobby's hand. "Well, old man," he said, "I expect you take good care of your mother while I'm gone." And Bobby said, "Okay." She knew she couldn't expect a letter for at least 2 weeks. But even so, toward the end of the second week, she began abandoning her studio every morning at 10 to watch for the mailman. He would come trudging along the post road while she breathed a silent prayer to him. "Oh, please, please." And more often than not, he would go on past the house. The few times he stopped to deposit something in her mailbox, it would turn out to be bills or advertisements. And once the familiar ugly business envelope from Amalgamated Tool and Die that contained her alimony check. In the third week, he brought her a real letter, but it wasn't the one she was praying for. The one in fragile airmail stationery with a British stamp and postmark. It was only a letter from her sister Eva, and she was so disappointed that she didn't even open it until there was nothing else to do in the tedious hours of the afternoon. When she did, she found that it contained startling news. Eva was getting married. 50-year-old Eva, the everlastingly plain and bossy big sister, the meddlesome old maid of the family, was announcing her engagement to someone named Owen Forbes from Austin, Texas. And the funny thing, the touching thing, was that Eva sounded so shy and formal about it. Owen is naturally eager to meet the members of my family, so we plan to spend much of our wedding trip in Indiana before settling in Austin. But I've been wondering if it might not be possible to spend a little time with you before we leave. Do you suppose you might come into the city some evening next week, and we could all have dinner together at some nice hotel like the Commodore? So it was pity and curiosity, as much or more than affection, that prompted her to pick up the phone and call Eva that very night. I think it's wonderful news, Eva, she said. Really, I'm so pleased and so happy for you. Well, thank you, dear. It was good of you to call. Eva was as shy on the phone as in the letter, as if she'd been afraid Alice might think the whole idea of her marriage was ludicrous. And when Alice sensed this and felt guilty about it because she had thought it was ludicrous in a way, it made her even more effusive than she'd planned to be. I'd love to meet him, she heard herself saying. But look, instead of meeting in the city, why don't you bring him out here? Wouldn't that be nicer? No, we've got plenty of room in case you'd like to spend the night. You'd be more than welcome. Really. More than welcome. This was the phrase that kept ringing in her memory while she readied the house for their visit. This house, filled with Strilling's belongings and horridly vacant of his presence, had become all but intolerable, and therefore the idea of receiving Eva and Mr. Owen Forbes of Austin, Texas, or anyone else in the world for that matter, was more than welcome. Guess what? She said to Bobby at breakfast. Remember your Aunt Eva? Well, Aunt Eva is getting married, and this evening she's going to bring her fiancé out here to meet us, and we'll all have dinner together, and they might even stay the night. Won't that be fun? What does that mean? What, dear? Fiancé. Well, it means the man she's going to marry. His name is Mr. Owen Forbes, and he comes from Texas. After they're married, he'll be your uncle. Oh. Bobby thoughtfully stirred his spoon around in the remains of his cream of wheat, and she could tell from the averted, almost sly look on his face that his next remark would be something less than wholly ingenuous. Mommy, he said, is Mr. Nelson your fiancé? No, dear, don't ask silly questions. I've explained all that to you before. Mr. Nelson and I are very dear friends. We care very much about each other, and we both care very much about you. You mean you're in love with each other, or what? I mean exactly what I said. Now, will you please just finish your cereal and stop asking silly... I'm not asking silly questions. All I mean is, if you and Mr. Nelson are in love with each other, and if you get married when he comes home from England, then what'll he be? My father, or what? Oh, Bobby, I know you know better than that. He'd be your stepfather. You mean he couldn't ever be my real father because Daddy's my real father, right? She sighed. Yes, dear, that's right. Then how come Aunt Eva's husband's going to be my uncle? Won't he just be my step-uncle? He'll be your uncle by marriage. Hurry along now, or you'll be late for school. The mailman passed her by again that morning, but she forced herself not to mind. She was fully composed by the time the taxi turned into the driveway that evening. The house was clean, and she and Bobby were both in their best clothes, wearing fixed, vulnerable smiles ready to make their visitors more than welcome. Owen Forbes turned out to be big, ruddy, and hearty, so engagingly forceful and masculine a man that Alice was surprised into thinking, how did Eva ever get him? And Eva was radiant. She was as plain and heavy-legged as ever, but she had bloomed into a new womanliness that was all the more impressive because she seemed conscious of it and proud of it. Heard a lot of very fine things about you, little lady, Owen Forbes said when he took Alice's hand, and he bent to give her a respectful little kiss on the cheek. Then he turned to Bobby. But instead of shaking hands, he made a fist and gently cuffed it around across the tip of Bobby's chin. Been hearing some pretty good things about you too, Buster, he said. How's it going? His booming voice and lumbering frame filled the house with authority. In the first few awkward moments of choosing chairs and getting the conversation started, he took command of them all, as if the house were his own and he were the host, and he put them all at ease. None for me, thanks, he said firmly when Alice offered cocktails. You girls go right ahead, though. And a moment later, hey, listen, he said to Bobby, you got a football? Thought we might get in a little catch outside before it gets dark. Bobby replied that he didn't have a football, but he had a baseball and a glove. Would that do? Great, said Owen Forbes, standing up and stripping off his coat for action. If you've only got one glove, you wear it. Then you can kind of just lob them over to me and I'll really burn them into you, okay? This really is a remarkable room, Alice, Eva said when they were alone together. Did you rent the house furnished? Alice was prepared for that question. She had already rehearsed her careful lie. And she was glad Bobby wasn't there to hear it. Well, no, most of these things are very valuable. They belong to some friends of mine who've gone to Europe for a while. And what's that? Eva inquired of the Purdah. Is it Persian? It's Burmese. These people are English, you see, and they lived in the Orient for some time. Well, it's very striking, Eva said. It's really very decorative. And now that these amenities were out of the way, they could get down over the pouring of second drinks to the serious business of discussing Owen Forbes. He had been a patient at the hospital where Eva worked. That was how they'd met. He's not as strong as he looks, you see, she explained. Actually, he's still in quite delicate health. That was why he'd had to give up his strenuous position as a history professor at NYU. And that was why they planned to settle in Austin. There in the gentler climate and the slower pace of life, in semi-retirement, he would find the leisure to finish the book he'd been planning for years. A scholarly treatise on the role of the AEF in the war. He himself had served in the AEF with distinction, emerging as a major. He'd been wounded and severely gassed, which was the origin of his ill health. He'd been married before to a woman who never understood him, who had divorced him and demanded an exorbitant alimony until her own remarriage. Now he was free at last, and he had chosen to share his new life with Eva Grumbauer. He needs me, Alice, Eva said as her embarrassed old maid's eyes began to fill with tears. That's the wonderful thing. I've never known anyone who's really needed me before. And Alice found it necessary to wipe her own eyes. Not only out of gladness for Eva, and not only because of the gin and vermouth, but because she had been touched with an ache of envy. To be needed. That was the wonderful thing. And even if she had been able to tell Eva about Sterling Nelson, could she honestly have said that Sterling Nelson needed her? But there was no more time for sentimentality, because Bobby and Owen Forbes had come banging and thumping back into the house, a couple of laughing, winded athletes ready for a solid meal. Owen Forbes took full charge of the happy dinner table, though he refused his share of the wine. He kept urging more meat and potatoes and milk on Bobby. You got to build yourself up if you want to develop that arm. And long before the evening was over, he had Bobby calling him Uncle Owen. Okay, champ, he said at Bobby's bedtime, get yourself a good night's sleep and I'll see you in the morning. You know what, Mommy? Bobby said when she went upstairs to tuck him in. Uncle Owen taught me how to throw. It's easy. What you do is, you do it with your whole body. You kind of put your whole body into it instead of just your arm. I mean, I haven't quite learned how to do it yet, but it's easy. Well, she said, isn't that nice? But they were gone by noon the next day, and after another morning in which the mailman passed her by, they were gone in a flurry of kisses and promises to write, bound for Indiana and then for Texas, and they left the house emptier than before. Toward the end of the 4th week, she had considered telephoning Sterling's office in New York to inquire discreetly if they'd heard from him, and to ask if they had an address in England at which he might be reached. But she dismissed the idea. After more than a day of thinking about it, and after getting as far 3 or 4 times as to pick up the phone and begin to place the call. It wasn't until a rainy day in the 5th week that she decided she could bear it no longer. When the mailman retreated up the road in the rain, leaving nothing in her box, she settled herself at the telephone with a fresh pack of cigarettes beside her for courage. She had called his office any number of times before, and it had been a simple matter of saying, "Mr. Nelson, please," to the switchboard operator, and then of hearing his secretary say, "Mr. Nelson's office," and then of hearing Sterling. Now she didn't quite know how to begin. I'd like to speak with Mr. Nelson's secretary," she told the switchboard girl. "Mr. Nelson's no longer with us." "No," I said, "his secretary. I know he's abroad, but I'd like to speak with his secretary, please." "Oh, you mean Miss Breen. She's working for Mr. Harding now. Just a moment." There was a buzzing and a clicking, and then another voice said, "Mr. Harding's office." It was the same cheerful Brooklyn accented voice that used to answer for Sterling. "Are you Miss Breen?" "Yes. I'm calling to inquire about Mr. Nelson." "Mr. Nelson's in London. Mr. Harding's handling all his accounts now. Perhaps he can—" No. This is a personal call. I just wanted to find out when Mr. Nelson is expected to return." There was a pause. "Well, as far as I know, he isn't expected to return. I mean, I believe he's been transferred to London on a permanent basis." Alice was patient. "No," she said, "I'm sure there must be some mistake. He was expected back in 4 to 6 weeks." "Oh, well, perhaps you'd like to speak with Mr. Cameron, our managing director." Yes, please." There was more buzzing and clicking and another secretary to deal with. Then, at last, a thunderous British voice said, "Cameron here. I'm calling to inquire about Mr. Sterling Nelson. I wondered if you could tell me when—" "If this is Gramercy Realty, I've nothing further to say. I've made it perfectly clear to you people that we are in no way responsible—" "No," she said, this isn't— please, Well, if you're another of his creditors, my answer's the same. We are in no way responsible for any debts he may have—" "No, look, please. This is a personal matter. I'm a personal friend of Mr. Nelson's, and I simply wondered if you could tell me when he's expected back." Mr. Cameron sighed audibly into the phone, and when he spoke again, he was less harsh, as if beginning to sense that this might indeed be a personal matter. Perhaps even a delicate one. "I see," he said. "Well, there seems to have been a good deal of confusion about Mr. Nelson's activities, to say the least. Matter of fact, you might be able to help us. Have you any knowledge of his whereabouts now?" "His whereabouts? Have you any address in England where he might be reached?" No, I don't have." "And you say he told you it was your understanding that he planned to return to this country?" Yes, that was my understanding." "Well, I'm afraid you were misinformed. Mr. Nelson's American visa had expired, and we chose not to arrange for its renewal. Then after he left, there began to be no end of nuisance here from his creditors, so I cabled London. The London office has replied that directly after reporting there, he severed his connection with the firm. And since he left no forwarding address, we're quite unable to trace him. Puts the firm in a most awkward position, but there's nothing we can—" Alice could never afterwards remember how she managed to conclude the conversation. All she knew was that when it was over, she sat paralyzed at the telephone table for a long time. Then she began walking through the house, looking at Sterling's things, touching them. Not crying, and not even wanting to cry. Realizing in wave after wave of pain that the gift of these things had been Sterling's way of saying goodbye. I think the less elaborate we make our goodbyes, the better, don't you? And he'd have known even then that it was forever. He'd known. He must have known even before the move to Scarsdale. And God only knew how long before that. He must have known she would one day be walking alone and bereft among his gifts, and he must have hoped in his quiet, knowledgeable way that she would understand. But she didn't understand. That was what made it impossible to cry. All she could do was walk and sit and get up and walk again, with the voice of Mr. Cameron echoing in her head. All she could do was fail and fail and fail to understand. A little after 3 o'clock, still walking, she began to know what she would do. She would go to the front window and wait for Bobby. No, better still, she would put on her raincoat and go out across the post road to wait for him. And when he came, he would say, "How come you're here?" And she would say, "Just waiting for you." And they would cross the road together and go into the house. Then Bobby's eyes would get very round, and he'd say, "What's the matter, Mommy? Is something the matter, or what?" And she wouldn't tell him right away. She would carefully put both of their raincoats on hangers to dry, and she would inquire how his day had been at school. But when he asked her again if something was the matter, she would break. She would go down on her knees and take him in her arms. She would gather him in and press him close, and then she knew that by then she'd be able to cry. Then she would say, "Oh, Bobby, he's gone. He's gone from us, and he's never coming back." That was how she planned it, and that was the way it happened.